Although seemingly deserted, the pueblos contained more residents than I first assumed. A middle-aged couple sat on a balcony 30 feet from me, the woman holding an unread book in her hands as her husband stared at the surface of the swimming pool. How does he know the book was unread? What the fuck is up with this guy? The woman holding an unread book in her hands as her husband stared at the surface of the swimming pool, whose reflection dressed the walls of a nearby apartment house with bands of gold light. Almost invisible at first glance, people sat on their terraces and patios, gazing at an unseen horizon like figures in the paintings of Edward Hopper. Already thinking of a travel article, I noted the features of this silent world: the memory-erasing white architecture, the enforced leisure that fossilized the nervous system, the almost Africanized aspect, but a North Africa invented by someone who had never visited the Maghreb, the apparent absence of any social structure, the timelessness of a world beyond boredom, with no past, no future, and a diminishing present. Perhaps this was what a leisure-dominated future would resemble. Nothing could ever happen in this affectless realm, where entropic drift calmed the surfaces of 1,000 swimming pools. I returned to my car, reassured by the distant sounds of the coastal highway. Following the Frenchwoman's instructions, I found my way back to the Malaga signpost and rejoined the motorway, which soon skirted an ochre beach and revealed a handsome peninsula of iron-rich rock. This was Estrella de Mar, as generously wooded and landscaped as Cap d'Antibes. There was a harbor lined with bars and restaurants, a crescent of imported white sand, and a marina filled with racing yachts and cruisers. Comfortable villas stood behind the palms and eucalyptus trees, and above them was the liner-like prow of the Club Nautico, topped by its white satellite dish. Then, as the motorway turned through the coastal pines, I saw the gutted eminence of the Hollinger Mansion on its hill above the town, the charred roofing timbers like the remains of a funeral pyre on a Central American mesa. The smoke and intense heat had blackened the walls, as if this doomed house had tried to camouflage itself against the night to come. Traffic overtook me, speeding towards the hotel towers of Fuengirola. I turned off onto the Estrella de Mar slip road and entered a narrow gorge cut through the porphyry rock of the headland. Within 400 yards, I reached the wooded neck of the peninsula, where the first villas stood behind their lacquered gates. Purpose-built in the 1970s by a consortium of Anglo-Dutch developers, Estrella de Mar was a residential retreat for the professional classes of Northern Europe. The resort had turned its back on mass tourism, and there were none of the skyscraper blocks that rose from the water's edge at Benalmádena and Torremolinos. God, what a name dropper this guy is. The old town by the harbor had been pleasantly bijouized. The fishermen's cottages converted to wine bars and antique shops. Motherfucker. Taking the road that led to the Club Nautico, I passed an elegant tea salon, a bureau de change decorated with Tudor half-timbering. Fucking A. And a boutique whose demure window displayed a solitary but exquisite designer gown. I waited as a van emblazoned with Trump Loyal traffic scenes reversed into the courtyard of a sculpture studio. A strong-shouldered woman with Germanic features, blonde hair pinned behind her neck, supervised two teenage boys as they began to unload butts of modeling clay. Okay. Within the open studio, half a dozen artists worked at their sculpture tables, smocks protecting their beach clothes. A handsome Spanish youth, heavy genitals scarcely contained by his posing pouch, stood with sullen grace on a podium as the sculptors, every one an amateur, judging by their earnest manner, massaged their clay into a likeness of his thighs and torso. Their burly instructor, a ponytailed Vulcan at his forge, moved among them, tweaking a navel with a stubby forefinger or smoothing a furrowed brow. Estrella de Mar, I soon discovered, had a thriving arts community. In the narrow streets above the harbor, a parade of commercial galleries showed the latest work of the resort's painters and designers. A nearby arts and crafts center displayed a selection of modernist costume jewelry, ceramic wares, and textiles. The local artists, all I assumed from their parked Mercedes and Range Rovers, residents of nearby villas, sat behind their trestle tables like Saturday vendors in the Portobello Road, their confident voices ringing with the accents of Holland Park and the 16th arrondissement. Everyone in the town seemed alert and confident. Customers crowded the bookshops and music stores, or scrutinized the racks of foreign newspapers outside the tobaccs. An adolescent girl in a white bikini crossed the street at the traffic lights, a violin case in one hand, a hamburger in the other. Estrella de Mar, I decided, possessed far more attractions than I had guessed when Frank first arrived to manage the Club Nautico. The monoculture of sun and sangria that becalmed the Pueblo residents had no place in this vibrant little enclave, which seemed to combine the best features of Bel Air and the left bank. Opposite the gates of the Club Nautico was an open-air cinema with an amphitheater carved from the hillside. A placard by the ticket kiosk advertised a season of Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy films, the very height of intellectual chic of a certain kind. The Club Nautico was quiet and cool, its afternoon trade yet to appear. Sprinklers rotated over the crisp lawns, and beside the deserted restaurant terrace, the surface of the pool was smooth enough to walk upon. A single player was practicing on one of the hard courts with a tennis machine. And the clunk-clunk of the bounding balls was the only sound to disturb the air. I crossed the terrace and entered the bar at the rear of the restaurant. A blonde steward with a babyish face and a sail rigger's shoulders was folding paper napkins into miniature yachts, origami decorations for the peanut saucers. "Are you a guest, sir?" He grinned cheerfully. "I'm afraid the club is closed to non-members." "I'm not a guest, or a non-member, whatever strange form of life that is." I sat down on a stool and helped myself to a few nuts. "I'm Frank Prentice's brother. I think he was the manager here." "Of course, Mr. Prentice," he hesitated, as if faced with an apparition, and then eagerly shook my hand. "Sonny Gardner. I crew on Frank's 30-footer. By the way, he still is the manager." "Good. He'll be glad to hear that." "How is Frank? We're all thinking about him." "He's fine. I met him yesterday. We had a long and interesting talk together." "Everyone hopes you can help Frank. The Club Nautico needs him." "That's fighting talk. Now, I'd like to see his apartment. There are personal things I want to collect for him. I take it someone has the keys." "You'll have to speak to Mr. Hennessy, the club treasurer. He'll be back in half an hour. I know he wants to help Frank. We're all doing everything we can." I watched him delicately fold the paper yachts with his calloused hands. His voice had sounded sincere but curiously distant, lines from a previous week's play spoken by a distracted actor. Turning on my stool, I gazed across the swimming pool. In its glassy surface, I could see the reflection of the Hollinger house, a sunken fire ship that seemed to rest on the tiled floor. "You had a grandstand view," I commented. "It must have been quite a spectacle." "View, Mr. Prentice?" Lines creased Sonny Gardner's baby-smooth forehead. "What of, sir?" "The fire at the big house. Did you watch it from here?" "No one did. The club was closed." "On the Queen's birthday? I would have thought you'd be open all night." I reached out and took the paper yacht from his fingers, examining its intricate folds. "One thing puzzles me. I was at the magistrate's court in Marbella yesterday. No one from Estrella de Mar turned up. None of Frank's friends. No character witnesses. No one who worked for him. Just an elderly Spanish lawyer who's given up hope." "Mr. Prentice," Gardner tried to fold the paper triangle when I returned it to him, then crushed it between his hands. "Frank didn't expect us there. In fact, he told Mr. Hennessy that he wanted us to stay away. Besides, he pleaded guilty." "But you don't believe that?" "Nobody does. But a guilty plea, it's hard to argue with." "Too true. Then tell me, if Frank didn't set fire to the Hollinger house, who did?" "Who knows?" Gardner glanced over my shoulder, eager for Hennessy to appear. "Maybe nobody did. That's hard to believe. It was a clear case of arson. I waited for Gardner to reply, but he merely smiled at me, the reassuring smile of professional sympathy reserved for the bereaved at funeral chapels. He seemed unaware that his fingers were no longer folding the paper napkins into his miniature flotilla, but had started to unwrap and smooth the triangular sails. As I walked away, he leaned over his little fleet like an infant cyclops and called out to me in a hopeful voice, "Mr. Prentice, perhaps it was spontaneous combustion." Rainbows rode the rotating sprinklers, slipping in and out of the spray like wraiths leaping a skipping rope. I strolled around the pool, whose untidy water swilled below the diving board, disturbed by a long-legged young woman swimming a crisply efficient backstroke. I sat down at a poolside table, admiring her graceful arms as they cleft the surface. Her wide hips rolled snugly in the water, and she might have been lying in the lap of a trusted lover. When she passed me, I noticed a crescent-shaped bruise that ran from her left cheekbone to the bridge of her strong nose, and the apparently swollen gums of her upper jaw. Seeing me, she swiftly turned into a fast crawl, hands ransacking the waves, a pigtail of long black hair following her like a fateful water snake. She hoisted herself up the ladder at the shallow end, snatched a toweling robe from a nearby chair, and set off without a backward glance for the changing rooms. The clunk of the tennis machine had resumed, sounding across the empty courts. A fair-skinned man in a turquoise Club Nautico tracksuit was playing against the machine as it fired balls across the net, barrel set to swing at random. Despite the screens of wire netting, I could see that an intense duel was taking place between player and machine. The man leapt across the court on his long legs, feet raking the clay as he raced to return every ball. Cross-court volley, lob, and backhand flip followed one another at breakneck pace. A misfire brought him skidding to the net to cut a drop shot into the tram lines, but he ran back to reach a baseline serve with his outstretched racket. Watching him, I realized that he was urging on the machine, willing it to beat him, beaming with pleasure when an ace knocked the racket from his hand. Yet I felt that the real duel was taking place was not between man and machine, but between rival factions within his own head. He seemed to be provoking himself, testing his own temper, curious to know how he would respond. Even when exhausted, he drove himself on, as if encouraging a less skillful partner. Once, surprised by his own speed and strength, he waited for the next ball with a dazed schoolboy grin. Although in his late 20s, he had the pale hair and youthful looks of a subaltern barely out of his teens. Deciding to introduce myself, I made my way through the courts. A skied ball sailed over my head and bounced across the empty clay. I heard him slam heavily into the side netting, and a moment later, the sound of a racket slashed against a metal post. He was leaving when I reached the practice court, stepping through the wire door by the opposite baseline. Surrounded by dozens of balls, the machine stood on its rubber wheels, timer ticking, the last 3 balls in its hopper. I crossed the court and stood among the skid marks, the choreography of a violent duel, of which the machine had been little more than a spectator. Tossed aside, the broken racket lay on a linesman's chair, its shaft a mass of splinters. I held the racket in my hand and heard the whip crack of the tennis machine. A heavy topspin swerve swung across the net and bit the clay a few inches inside the baseline, swerving past my legs to rebound against the fencing. A second ball, faster than the first, clipped the top of the net and stung the ground at my feet. The last ball bounced high at my chest. I flailed at it with the damaged racket and sent it over the netting into the next court. Beyond the tennis machine, the wire door opened briefly. A raised hand saluted me, and above the towel around the player's neck, I saw a wry but cheerful grin. Then he strode away, slapping the netting with the visor of his cap. Nursing the torn skin on my hand, I left the court and strode back to the club, in time to see him disappear through the rainbows that swayed across the lawn. Perhaps the tennis machine had malfunctioned, but I guessed that he had reset the mechanism when he saw me approach. Intrigued to know how I would react to the vicious serves. Already I was thinking of the testing games that this high-strung man would almost certainly have played with Frank. and of the luckless machine now summoned to take my brother's place.